In today's video, we're going to talk about object relations theory, which was developed by Melanie Klein. She was very influenced by the work of Sigmund Freud, but she found that the subjectivity, when she studied children, the inner subjectivity was profoundly more important, she felt, than some of the unconscious work of early psychodynamic thinking. When she worked with children, what she found is that children attribute positive and negative emotional states to different things in their environment, which sounds very obvious in a way. But the profound shift that she discovered was that these emotional experiences of the world get internalized into fixed objects in the child. When the child experiences, say, a person, let's say their mother, they're not experiencing the mother as a person, as a consciousness. In fact, they don't have the cognitive, development in order to do that. What they're really experiencing is parts of the mother that are separated into these good and bad emotional states. Good and bad objects, in Kleinian terms, are how the child carves up the world to know on some level how to respond. So if the voice of the mother is soothing and caring, it becomes a good object. If it's hostile and neglectful, it becomes a bad object. And as the child experiences more of the mother, they become to internalize more representations of her. And over time, this might become a fuller picture of what the mother is in later childhood. This process of splitting, as Klein called it, splitting the world into good and bad objects, can often prevent children from maturing their view of the world and tolerating their own experience. It becomes a defense against bad objects in a way that can only accept good objects. So, for example, a child might start to shut down their need for comfort when the parent is hostile, is stressed, for example, which might make sense in the context of that parent-child dynamic. But if they internalize that care itself is a bad object, they grow up, they form relationships where that same experience becomes evoked and they have the same emotional triggers in other relationships that they did in their early childhood with their mother. When a child splits the world into good and bad objects routinely, Klein calls this the paranoid schizoid position, because schizoid is really just about dissociating, and what the child does is dissociates good from bad, and that means that the same person or the same object can evoke polar opposite emotional responses according to the part of the object that the child experiences. What was really important for psychotherapy, and particularly for person-centred theory later on, is this idea of the depressive position, that around the age of about 8 months, the child learns to tolerate the fact that there is good and bad in objects around them, so that the mother, while they need her, is also absent. It's about this human acknowledgement that we all have to face, which is that of the people that love and care about us, they also have tendencies to be hurtful, to be dismissive, or in some sense to be bad objects. And when we learn this is what Klein said is a healthy state of mind. Even though it's a depressive position, it's about accepting, it's one of the first theories of acceptance in psychology. In object relations theory then, we have the paranoid schizoid position where a person separates the world into good and bad objects. But our aim in counselling and psychotherapy is to try and support more depressive position functioning, as they would call it. But really all that means is sitting with the client's polarization of good and bad and helping them to experience both of those attributes in everything around them. Klein's theory went a stage further, and what she noticed is that there are paired object relations, what are called object relations dyads, that create a union in the client's unconscious and can affect the way that they form relationships. If they internalize the self-image, the self as a victim, and they internalize the other as a persecutor, then this paired dyad gets recreated in their future relationships. So as the therapist, when you're working with that client, you might start to experience them feeling victimized by your questioning or feeling victimized by the way that you're trying to work with them. And Freud had this idea of countertransference, that you take on this persecutor role. And what Klein is doing is modeling what's happening here, is saying that internally, the self gets represented as a victim. The other gets represented as the persecutor. And so the client experiences you through that object relations dyad. And the work here is to help the client shift their internal representation of care. And here's where I think the person-centered approach really integrates with a Kleinian model. Klein is saying that the client, will often resort to a defense of splitting, of putting things into good and bad categories emotionally. And if we learn to intensify that, to, for example, take Gendlin's stages of process, we can work with the client in a way that helps them to process the defense against care. And in this case, what Gendlin would suggest is, first of all, we intensify the split. We're not trying to solve the problem of the split. We're not trying to contradict or challenge it. We're trying to say, it really feels like my questioning is harsh on you today. Or the way I phrased that seemed to be quite attacking towards you, and that left you feeling quite victimized by what I said. So first of all, we try to intensify the split, intensify the good and bad object experience. Then we help the client to acknowledge it and face it. By acknowledging it, we might ask them for what is their experience, And if it's about us, we also have to sit and tolerate that. So they may say things like, "You were really cruel to me just then." In the stages of process, what we're trying to do is to face this emotional experience head on. Because if we can face it for the client, or in front of them or with them, then they can learn to face it too. And what Klein is modeling here is that underneath the surface, there's a representation that this is a persecutor in front of me. So by not being the persecutor, by modeling a different internal representation for the client, we help them to change the way that they split us into a bad object and themselves into a good object. So by intensifying, acknowledging, and tolerating, the client starts to work through to emotionally process what's happening in the room. And for me, this is an incredibly powerful person-centered approach. But what I'm doing is I'm using that Kleinian frame to know what's important to pick up on in the session. And it's not always that you as the therapist is the bad object. In fact, in many cases, it's the reverse, that you become an idealized object. The person that is all caring and can do no wrong, and the client is the bad object. And in this case, you would do the same process, but in reverse. It seems like I have all the answers and I know what to do to keep myself regulated, but you just can't do that for yourself. And many therapists can feel like they're reflecting back hurtful and harmful details about what the client experiences. But Melanie Klein says to trust, in a sort of humanistic way, that the client will naturally grow from this, and that by arriving at a depressive position, and we don't need to use that language, we can just say at a position of integrating good and bad, they start to experience themselves in a more full way, and the therapist too, and therefore their environment. So in many respects, I think this fits very well with the person-centered approach. It just gives us a different model to work with when the client is talking in quite polarized ways about you, about their world. It's knowing that that is the process to sit with, that it's the splitting, that we can work with in the moment, and the experience of splitting will take the client ultimately on a journey of safety. Hopefully that's been an interesting introduction to object relations theory. Of course, there's many more complexities to it that, I would encourage you to look out for if you're interested in knowing more about it. But it gives me a bit of a way of working with splitting in the room, and I find that it enhances my person-centred practice. So hopefully that's been a helpful introduction, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in next week's video.